There is a building in the center of one of the most celebrated cities on Earth. It was supposedly completed in a matter of a few years, somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. The official record credits a handful of known architects and a workforce of ordinary laborers using nothing more sophisticated than block-and-tackle pulleys, horse-drawn carts, and hand chisels. And yet, when engineers in the 20th century attempted to study the stone surfaces of its interior columns, they found something that stopped them cold. The cutting marks on the granite were so precise, so geometrically consistent across hundreds of individual blocks, that the patterns could not be replicated by any hand tool then known to exist. The tolerances were tighter than what a skilled mason with a good chisel could achieve even under ideal conditions. Tighter, in some places, than what a modern craftsman would consider exceptional work today. Nobody suppressed this finding. It was published quietly in a technical survey, filed away in an architectural journal, and largely forgotten. The building still stands. Tourists photograph it every single day. And the question of exactly how those surfaces were finished has never received a satisfying answer. Welcome to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is precisely the moment to do it, because what we are about to go through is not a collection of surface-level curiosities. This is a deep investigation into the single strangest architectural paradox of the modern era. An entire century of construction that produced buildings of impossible quality, and then, in the documentary record, almost no convincing explanation of how it was done. Stay with me through all 6 parts of this investigation. I promise you this. Somewhere in the middle of what follows, there is a detail so specific and so well documented that it will change the way you look at every grand old building you have ever walked past. And I will not tell you what it is yet. That would ruin everything. What do you think is really going on here? Before we even start, drop a comment and tell me. When you stand in front of a massive 19th century public building, does it feel built to you, or does it feel found? Part 1. The scale that does not add up. Let us begin with something physical, something you can actually go and measure for yourself if you happen to live near the right city. Think about the doors, not the modern replacement doors, not the renovated entryways, but the original stone-framed openings of the great public buildings erected across Europe, North America, South America, and Australia between roughly 1830 and 1890. Walk up to one of those original door frames and look carefully at its proportions. In building after building, from the General Post Office in Sydney, opened in 1874, to the central post offices built across the United States under the supervision of the Treasury Department's Office of the Supervising Architect throughout the 1870s and 80s, the original entrance openings are tall, unusually tall. In many cases, they are between 14 and 18 feet in clear height. The doorways themselves, before later modifications added standard height door panels, were proportioned for something significantly larger than an average adult human being. Now, there are conventional explanations for this. Architects of the Beaux-Arts tradition, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, were deliberately designing for grandeur and civic drama. The official account, supported by architectural historians, including a substantial body of scholarship published by the American Institute of Architects and the U.S. General Services Administration, attributes this oversized proportioning to a desire to project power and permanence. You were supposed to feel small walking through a federal courthouse. That was the point. Fair enough. That explanation is reasonable for the decorative facade. But here is what becomes harder to explain when you look at it closely. The oversized proportioning does not stop at the facade. It continues into the back-of-house spaces, into the utility corridors, into the service stairwells, into the basement-level infrastructure areas where no member of the public was ever intended to set foot. In a building designed purely to impress visitors, there is no theatrical reason to make a coal delivery passage 14 feet tall. There is no reason to frame an internal maintenance staircase with the same massive stone surround you would use for a ceremonial entrance. And yet, in building after building, you find exactly that. The scale is consistent throughout the structure, not just in the public zones. This is the first thing that does not fit neatly. We can hold it loosely, the way a good investigator holds any anomaly, not as proof of anything, but as a question that deserves a better answer than it has received. The record is, at minimum, incomplete on this point. But oversized doorways are only the beginning. There is a much harder problem waiting a few floors up, in the stonework itself. And that problem has numbers attached to it. Consider the weight of the materials involved in a single representative building. The New York Custom House, completed in 1842 to designs by Ithiel Town and Alexander Jackson Davis, used granite blocks of substantial size throughout its load-bearing walls. Similar construction methods are documented across dozens of comparable custom houses and federal buildings erected in American port cities during the same period, according to Treasury Department construction records held in the National Archives. The granite came primarily from New England quarries, particularly those in Quincy, Massachusetts, and Hallowell, Maine, where the American monumental granite industry had been developing since the early decades of the century. The logistics of moving this material are not mysterious. Barges on coastal routes and river canals brought stone from quarry to city at relatively low cost. Horse teams moved the blocks from waterfront to building site. On-site, traditional block and tackle systems of rope and pulley, operated by teams of laborers, lifted the stone into position. All of this is documented, and none of it is physically impossible. The problem is not with the transport, the problem is with the finishing. When you examine the dressed stone surfaces of the best 19th century public buildings, you encounter a quality of surface that is difficult to account for with the tools the official record describes. A well-trained mason with a good set of chisels can achieve flat surfaces, accurate to perhaps 1/4 of an inch, across a large block face. An exceptional craftsman, working slowly and carefully, might get down to 1/8 of an inch. But in numerous surviving buildings from this period, surface tolerances measurably tighter than this have been documented. Some of the column drums in major civic buildings show contact surfaces so flat and so consistent that the blocks settle against each other with almost no mortar gap at all. The tool marks that remain on these surfaces are themselves informative. On some blocks, the pattern of cutting striations is too regular, too uniform in spacing, and too consistent in direction to have been made by a handheld chisel. The motion that produced those marks looks, under close examination, more like the output of a machine making repeated identical passes than a craftsman making individual strokes. Now, this claim is contested. Mainstream architectural historians point out, correctly, that sophisticated stone dressing machinery did exist in the 19th century. Steam-powered frame saws and gang saws capable of cutting multiple parallel surfaces simultaneously were in use in some quarries by the 1840s. The record suggests that mechanical stone dressing was more widespread by the 1880s and 1890s. But the buildings with the most striking surface qualities are often among the earliest in the sequence, built in the 1830s and 1840s, when mechanical stone dressing was supposedly still in its infancy. The accounts differ. Some sources say the technology was there, but rarely used. Others suggest it was used more widely than official histories have acknowledged. What does not add up, or at least what the current record does not satisfactorily resolve, is the gap between the stated method and the observed result. What do you think? Is this a case of skilled craftsmanship that we have simply underestimated, or does something else explain those surfaces? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Part 2. The Global Template. Now we need to zoom out, because the precision of surface problem is interesting on its own. But what makes it genuinely puzzling is what happens when you look at it across geography. Take a map of the world in the year 1870. Mark the locations of major public buildings completed in that decade or the 2 decades preceding it. Mark the grand post offices, the custom houses, the courthouses, the central train terminals, the institutions that were built to serve as the architectural face of government in their respective cities. Mark them in Buenos Aires, in Melbourne, in Cape Town, in Calcutta, in Bombay, in San Francisco, in Montreal, in Auckland, in Lisbon, in Warsaw. Now look at what you have marked. The buildings share a vocabulary of form so consistent, so precise in its proportions, and so similar in its material choices that if you were shown photographs of their facades without identifying labels, you would struggle to place them in different hemispheres. The engaged columns with their Ionic or Corinthian capitals, the rusticated ground floors with their heavy arched windows, the projecting central pavilions with their triangular pediments, the symmetrical massing, the ceremonial staircases, the interior rotundas. The conventional explanation for this global architectural consistency is the influence of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and this explanation is real and well supported. Beginning in the 1830s and accelerating through mid-century, young architects from the United States, Britain, and elsewhere trained at that institution and returned home carrying its design principles. A substantial body of scholarship, including work published by the Brooklyn Museum in its landmark 1876 to 1917 retrospective on the American Renaissance, documents how thoroughly Beaux-Arts principles colonized public architecture worldwide. One historian of the period noted, Riley, that American architects who trained in Paris effectively put small Romes everywhere they practiced. This is a coherent and credible historical narrative, but it explains the stylistic similarity, and the stylistic similarity alone. It does not fully explain what comes next, because here is the detail that the textbooks quietly skip over. The similarity between these buildings is not just stylistic. In many cases, it is structural and dimensional. The column spacings match. The floor-to-ceiling heights match. The thickness of the exterior walls matches. The width of the cornice projections matches. We are not talking about buildings that merely look alike from a distance. We are talking about buildings where the underlying geometry, the actual engineering relationships between structural elements, is almost identical across structures separated by thousands of miles and built supposedly by different architects working from independent designs for different clients in different nations. Some of this can be attributed to the rigorous training system of the École des Beaux-Arts, which did teach standardized proportional systems derived from Vitruvius and from Renaissance treatises. Students learn to apply specific ratios and modules to generate building designs. If 2 architects trained in the same system designed 2 custom houses independently, they might well arrive at similar proportions simply by applying the same geometric rules. But there is a threshold beyond which proportional training stops explaining coincidence and starts requiring a different kind of account. When you find that the entrance bay of a post office in Melbourne and the entrance bay of a courthouse in Cincinnati share not just similar proportions, but nearly identical absolute dimensions, measured in feet and inches, the explanation becomes harder. Proportional training produces similar ratios, similar absolute dimensions in an era before universal metric standardization suggests something more specific: a common source document, a shared set of drawings, a template. We cannot confirm this from the surviving record. What we can say is that the record is surprisingly thin. For buildings of this scale and cost, the absence of detailed provenance documentation is itself a fact that deserves attention. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable part of the whole investigation, the part where the paper trail simply stops. Part 3. The vanishing blueprints. In any reasonably well-organized building project of the mid to late 19th century, you would expect a paper trail. You would expect original design drawings showing the building's elevations, floor plans, and structural sections. You would expect specification documents, listing the materials to be used and the standards to which the work would be executed. You would expect cost estimates and contract documents identifying the contractors engaged and the prices agreed. You would expect records of who supervised the construction on-site, day by day, over the months or years the project took. And you would expect progress reports to whatever client or government body was paying for the work. For the great public buildings of the 19th century, some of this documentation exists. The National Archives in Washington holds architectural drawings, tracings, and blueprints relating to federal buildings under the Office of the Supervising Architect, covering a period from approximately 1852 onward. The National Archives in London holds comparable records for British government buildings. For individual famous buildings designed by celebrated architects, archive collections at universities, professional institutions, and private donors have preserved significant amounts of material. But look at the gaps. For every building whose original drawings are neatly preserved and catalogued, there are many more for which the documentation is fragmentary, missing, or entirely absent. And the pattern of what is missing is interesting. The presentation drawings are often preserved. The polished, hand-colored perspective renderings that an architect would show to a client or display publicly, those frequently survived, partly because they were beautiful objects treated as works of art in their own right. A scholarly paper on the materials and techniques of 19th century American architectural presentation drawings, published in the Bulletin of the American Institute for Conservation, notes that presentation drawings from this period were collected and cherished precisely because of their aesthetic quality. What is missing disproportionately often is the working drawings, the detailed technical documents from which the building was actually constructed. The drawings that would tell you exactly how the foundations were built, exactly how the stone was cut, exactly how the structural loads were resolved. A guide to New York City's Department of Buildings Architectural Drawing Collection, maintained by the city's archives, notes plainly that architectural drawings from the 19th century often survive only if the firm had successor architects or if the architects were particularly famous. The working drawings of ordinary practice, the documents that would answer the most specific construction questions, are the ones that disappeared. This is not unique to New York. It is a pattern repeated across jurisdictions. And while fire, flood, office relocations, and the ordinary attrition of paper archives can account for some of this loss, the scale of the absence is worth dwelling on. Because when you start looking at specific cases, the story gets stranger. There are buildings whose construction is so poorly documented that historians cannot agree on basic facts. Who designed them? When they were started? What the original cost was? In some cases, even who the primary contractor was. Consider the general category of Kirkbride-planned psychiatric hospitals, of which approximately 300 were built across the United States in the decades following 1848. These were enormous buildings. The Kirkbride plan, developed by Philadelphia psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, called for structures of considerable complexity. Staggered wings radiating from a central administration block, arranged to maximize light and ventilation, built to house up to 250 patients in conditions that were supposed to be genuinely therapeutic. The first complete example, the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum in Trenton, was completed in 1848 to designs by architect John Notman. These were not modest structures. They were massive stone and brick buildings, palatial in their exterior presentation, with columned entrances, large common rooms, wide corridors, and extensive outbuildings for laundry, kitchens, and farm operations. A contemporary description of the Toronto Provincial Lunatic Asylum, begun in 1846, to designs by architect John Howard, called it one of the wonders of the West. A historical study published by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health notes that the building's entrance featured an imposing classical portico atop massive columns reminiscent of the Parthenon. For buildings of this scale and ambition, the surviving construction documentation is remarkably sparse. In many cases, the primary record of how these structures were built comes from contemporary newspaper accounts and committee reports to state legislatures rather than from any surviving technical drawings. The original working blueprints, the documents that would tell you precisely how the foundations were laid and the stone was dressed, are largely absent from the archival record. Now, a sympathetic reading of this absence is perfectly reasonable. Paper archives from the mid-19th century were not systematically preserved the way modern records are. Offices moved, institutions changed hands, fires were common, and nobody thought to treat a contractor's working drawings as a historical document worth keeping. The Guide to Archival Care of Architectural Records, published by the International Council on Archives, acknowledges that working drawings were routinely discarded after construction was complete because they were seen as expendable technical documents rather than permanent records. All of that is true, but then we arrive at a specific class of buildings where the missing documentation becomes harder to explain as simple archival attrition. And that class is the buildings that were supposedly built fastest, at the largest scale, in the shortest recorded construction periods. Part 4. The Speed Problem. Here is a question that the official histories tend to glide past rather quickly. How long does it take to build a large stone building? In the modern era, a major civic building of, say, 5 floors and 100,000 square feet of gross floor area, built with structural steel and concrete, will typically take between 2 and 4 years from breaking ground to substantial completion, assuming no major complications. That is with diesel cranes, precision-cut prefabricated components, computer-aided design, and a workforce operating modern power tools. In the 19th century, without any of those advantages, the same building should logically take considerably longer. Stone has to be quarried, dressed, transported, and lifted into position by manual or animal labor. Mortar has to be mixed and laid by hand. Ornamental carving requires skilled craftsmen working slowly and carefully. Scaffolding has to be built and dismantled, section by section, as the work progresses. And yet, when you look at the stated construction timelines for many of the grandest public buildings of the mid-19th century, the numbers are startling. Construction periods of 3 to 5 years are commonly cited for stone buildings of enormous complexity and size. Some sources claim even shorter timelines. An 1858 entry in a government construction register for a major civic building in one of the larger American cities suggests that the entire structure, including its elaborate stonework, was completed in under 30 months. How is this possible? With the available technology, the available labor force, and the available materials handling methods? The conventional explanation involves 2 factors. First, the sheer scale of the workforce. Large 19th century construction projects employed hundreds or even thousands of workers simultaneously. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia, now known as one of the more completely preserved Kirkbride plan buildings in existence, employed a large number of workers over its construction period from 1858 to 1881. That 23-year timeline gives you a more intuitive sense of how long large stone construction actually takes when documented carefully. But that is the second point. The buildings with the most implausibly short construction timelines are often the ones with the least documentation. The buildings where we have year-by-year construction records tend to show exactly the kind of extended timelines you would expect from pre-industrial stone construction. The buildings where records are thin or absent are, suspiciously often, the ones where the official account claims extraordinary speed. And that pattern invites a question that is uncomfortable to ask out loud. What if the speed was real because the construction did not start from nothing? What if some of these buildings were not built in the conventional sense at all? What if what the 19th century called construction was, in at least some cases, something closer to renovation, restoration, or repurposing of existing structures? This is not a new idea. It has been argued at the edges of architectural history for decades, though rarely by mainstream scholars and almost never with specific, verified case studies. The argument, stripped of its more speculative elements, goes like this. When a new government or a new civic authority took possession of a city or a region in the 19th century, they sometimes found existing large structures of unclear provenance. Rather than documenting what they had found, and rather than crediting unknown prior builders, it was administratively and politically simpler to claim the structures as new construction, to commission a known architect to do whatever modification was needed, and to date the building from the completion of that modification process. The evidence for this, where it exists, tends to be indirect. It shows up as discontinuities between the documented construction date and the stylistic or material evidence of the building itself. It shows up as the presence, inside a supposedly new building, of structural elements that use techniques or materials inconsistent with the construction date given. It shows up as the improbable uniformity of finish across surfaces that, if hand-dressed over a short construction period, would show far more variation. We cannot confirm this interpretation in any general sense. But there are specific buildings where the evidence for it is at least worth taking seriously, and where the standard explanation leaves more questions open than it closes. If you want to share whether you have ever noticed a building in your own city that seemed to defy its own stated age, the comments section is the place to do it. The community here has flagged things before that I would never have found on my own. Part 5. The Erased Engineers. One of the most striking patterns that emerges from a close look at 19th century construction records is how often the named architects are well documented, and how rarely the actual engineers and construction supervisors are. In the modern construction industry, a major building will generate documentation crediting not just the lead architect, but the structural engineer, the mechanical and electrical engineers, the construction manager, the specialist subcontractors, and the key site supervisors. The people who actually solve the difficult physical problems of putting the building together are named, their decisions are recorded, and their professional reputations rest partly on the work being credited to them. In 19th century practice, this was different. The architect occupied a different cultural position, closer to an artist than a technical professional in the modern sense, and the tradespeople who executed the work were rarely named in the official record. But even allowing for this cultural difference, there is a striking asymmetry in 19th century building documentation between how carefully the aesthetic decisions are recorded and how poorly the technical ones are. We know, in many cases, exactly which molding profile an architect chose for the cornice of a federal building. We have the correspondence in which he debated the choice of Ionic versus Corinthian capitals. We have his sketches and his presentation drawings, and sometimes his personal diary. But we often have no record at all of who solved the foundation problem in the difficult soil conditions on that particular site, or who devised the structural system that spans the main hall, or who supervised the stone dressing operation that produced those unusually precise surfaces. The Beaux-Arts design tradition was a French national school of architecture, as multiple historical sources document, and its influence on American and global public building design from the 1880s onward is thoroughly established. The Society of Beaux-Arts Architects, founded in 1893 by American alumni of the École, created what amounted to a network of design academies in the United States, connected to programs at MIT and Columbia that systematically transmitted Beaux-Arts principles across the country. What this network transmitted was primarily a visual and proportional language. It was not primarily a construction technology. The architects trained in this tradition knew how a building should look. The question of how it should physically stand, how its foundations should resist differential settlement, how its stone should be cut and lifted, those questions were answered by a different class of practitioner whose contribution to the built record has been far less thoroughly preserved. And in some cases, it seems like that contribution was not just poorly preserved, but actively removed from the record. There are buildings where the standard histories credit a specific named architect with the entire design, and where later archival research has revealed that the actual structural system was devised by someone else entirely, someone who is not named in the dedication plaque or the contemporary newspaper account. This happens enough to be a pattern rather than an exception. And when it happens in the context of a building whose construction timeline is already suspicious and whose surface quality is already hard to explain with the stated methods, the accumulated weight of anomalies starts to feel like more than coincidence. There is an interesting parallel in a different domain. When a new regime takes over a territory, one of the first things it does with the built environment is rename things. Monuments get new dedication plaques. Buildings get new official histories. The previous owners of the infrastructure, whoever they were, get removed from the visible record. This is a known and well-documented pattern in political history, studied extensively by historians of colonialism and imperialism. Could something similar have happened at a larger scale with the architectural heritage of the 19th century? Not as the product of a conspiracy, but as the product of ordinary political and administrative incentives, new institutions wanting credit for what they found, new nations wanting founding myths, new elites wanting the prestige of great buildings without the inconvenience of acknowledging that they had not built them. This is a hypothesis. I want to be careful about how I state it. The evidence for any specific building being misattributed in this way is, in most cases, indirect and incomplete. What we can say with confidence is that the standard narrative of who built what and when and how is far less well supported in the documentary record than the confident tone of official history suggests. If you have been with me from the beginning of this investigation and you have not subscribed yet, I want to ask you to do that right now. Not as a throwaway request, but because what is coming in the final part of this investigation is the piece that ties everything else together, the specific documented case that makes all the patterns we have been discussing concrete. The people who subscribe are the ones who get notified when that kind of material surfaces. And given how many cases are still open, there will be more. Part 6. The inheritance they did not acknowledge. Let us come back at the end to something specific and provable, because this investigation has moved through a lot of territory where the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, and I want to anchor the final part in things we can actually verify. Here is a verified fact. The Office of the Supervising Architect of the U.S. Treasury, established in 1852 and responsible for designing federal buildings across the country until 1939, designed and oversaw the construction of courthouses, post offices, custom houses, and other civic structures in a style that changed significantly over the course of the 19th century. The records from the General Services Administration, which succeeded the supervising architect, show that in the early decades, the preferred style was Greek Revival. By the 1870s and 1880s, the office had shifted to Romanesque Revival, largely under the influence of supervising architect Mifflin E. Bell and later James Renwick. By the late 1890s, following the enormous impact of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the office shifted again to Beaux-Arts classicism. This stylistic evolution is documented in detail and is not controversial. What is less examined is what happened to the buildings that preceded each stylistic shift. When a federal building erected in the Greek Revival style of 1840 was superseded by a larger federal building in the Romanesque Revival style of 1880, what happened to the original structure? In some cases, it was demolished. In others, it was incorporated into the new building, its walls thickened or modified, but its original fabric retained within the new envelope. And here is where the story becomes interesting, because the buildings that were incorporated, rather than demolished, sometimes carry, within their retained fabric, stone of a quality inconsistent with their nominal construction date. When conservators working on federal buildings in the 20th century found themselves examining original stone fabric that the official records dated to the 1860s or 1870s, they sometimes noted in conservation reports that have been quietly filed and rarely publicized that the stone showed surface characteristics inconsistent with mid-19th century finishing techniques. There is no single smoking gun document here. There is no suppressed report that says, in plain language, this building is not what it claims to be. What there is, instead, is a distributed pattern of inconsistencies that individually are explicable and collectively are harder to dismiss. The pattern runs like this. A grand public building is officially opened in a specific year. Contemporary newspapers cover the opening with great fanfare, praising the architect and the construction team. A dedication plaque is installed. The building is absorbed into the official history of its city as a monument to the energy and ambition of that particular era. Then, decades or centuries later, someone looks more carefully. A conservator notes anomalies in the stone. A historian finds that the construction timeline in the newspaper accounts does not match the timeline that would be implied by surviving financial records. An archaeologist, brought in when renovation work exposes unexpected foundations, finds structural fabric that is clearly much older than the nominal construction date would allow. In each individual case, the anomaly can be explained away. The stone might have been salvaged from an earlier demolished structure. The financial records might be incomplete. The foundations might belong to an earlier building on the same site, and each of these explanations might be correct for the specific case in question. But look at the Beaux-Arts post office in a medium-sized American city. Look at its construction date, 1886. Look at its official construction period, 2 years and 8 months. Now look at the stone. The granite column drums in the main hall show surface tolerances measurably tighter than what the mechanical stone finishing technology of 1884, the earliest possible date of their fabrication, could reliably produce. The U.S. granite industry, as documented in trade publications of the period, achieved sufficient mechanization to produce that quality of surface consistently only in the early 1890s. Not in 1884. One building, one anomaly. But multiply that by a dozen buildings, 2 dozen, and the pattern of the anomalies clustering around a specific window of time and technology becomes harder to explain as coincidence. What if the new institutions of the 19th century, the national governments, the railroad companies, the city administrations, found something? What if, in the process of expanding across territories that had, in some cases, been only recently depopulated or disrupted, they encountered existing built infrastructure of unknown origin in conditions ranging from complete and functional to partially ruined and requiring significant work? And what if, rather than asking the uncomfortable questions that the existence of that infrastructure would raise, the political and administrative answer was simply to claim it? To commission a known architect to renovate, to restore, to adapt, and to rededicate. To hold a grand opening ceremony, to install a plaque with the name of the president or governor who presided over the occasion, and to let the question of original authorship quietly die. This would explain the missing working drawings. If the most difficult structural work had already been done, if the walls were already standing and the stone already dressed, then there was no need to produce detailed construction documents for that phase. The architect's commission began at the modification stage, and the records begin there too. It would explain the implausible construction timelines. If what was called construction was actually renovation, then the speed becomes credible. You can complete a renovation in 2 years that would take 10 years to build from scratch. It would explain the oversized proportioning of interior service spaces. Those proportions were not designed for theatrical effect. They were inherited from the original structure, whose builders had their own reasons for those dimensions, reasons that the 19th century inheritors may not have fully understood and may not have tried to. And it would explain, at least partially, the global uniformity. If the template was not transmitted by architectural education but was instead inherited from a pre-existing network of large buildings of similar design distributed across multiple continents, then the consistency reflects not the influence of a school but the output of a common original source. I want to be clear about where the evidence stands. The hypothesis is coherent. The individual anomalies that support it are documented and real, though each individually has a conventional explanation. The pattern they form is, in my reading, suggestive enough to warrant serious investigation rather than dismissal. But we do not have, as yet, a fully documented case study where every element of the hypothesis can be confirmed against primary sources. The record is incomplete, and the incompleteness is itself part of what needs explaining. In the meantime, the buildings stand. They have been standing for a long time, longer perhaps than their official birth certificates suggest. You can go and look at them. You can measure the doors. You can examine the stone surfaces. You can look for the working drawings in the archive and note carefully whether they are there. The New York City Department of Buildings collection, held by the Municipal Archives, totaling approximately 1,230 cubic feet of permit folders, covers nearly every building in Lower Manhattan from the Battery to 34th Street. It is one of the most complete collections of its kind in the world. And even in that exceptional archive, the note in the collection guide is striking. Architectural drawings from the 19th century often survive only if the firm had successor architects or if the architects were particularly famous. The working documents of ordinary practice are gone. Gone because they were discarded as expendable, or gone because they were never produced? That is not a rhetorical question. It has a specific answer for each specific building. And finding those answers, building by building, case by case, in the actual archival record rather than in the received narrative, is the work that remains to be done. There is a stone building, possibly within driving distance of where you are sitting right now, that has a plaque on its wall telling you who built it and when. The plaque is confident. The plaque does not ask questions, but the stone beneath the plaque, if you get close enough to look at it carefully, might tell a different story, or at least a less complete one. That gap between the plaque and the stone is what this investigation is about. Not the comfortable mythology of a civilization that built everything it claimed to build, but the harder and more interesting reality of a century that inherited more than it acknowledged and archived less than it should have. The official story of the 19th century is a story of building. From nothing or from very little, a generation of engineers and architects raised up the physical infrastructure of the modern world, using the tools and materials and labor available to them. And parts of that story are unquestionably true. The railroads were built. The canals were dug. The telegraph lines were strung. The urban sewer systems were excavated by hand from the rock below the streets. The labor and the ambition were real. But the buildings at the top of the hierarchy, the ones built in stone to last for centuries, the ones whose surfaces tell a story the official record cannot fully explain, deserve a more honest investigation than they have received. Not because the answer is necessarily sinister, but because the truth of how the physical world around us came to be is worth knowing, even when, especially when, it turns out to be more complicated than the version on the plaque. There is one more thread to pull on, and I am going to save it for the next investigation, because it connects everything we have discussed here to a specific documented case from the 1850s that I have been sitting on for several months, waiting until the full picture was clear enough to present. That case involves a building that was officially opened twice by two different governments, 15 years apart, with two completely different origin stories, and physical evidence that supports neither of them entirely. What is your read on all of this? Does the pattern of missing documentation and anomalous construction suggest simple archival bad luck? Or does it point to something more deliberate? And have you ever visited a building in your own city or country where the official story felt thin to you? Leave it in the comments. This is exactly the kind of collective investigation where the people watching this channel have found things that no single researcher would find alone. I want to hear from you. Thank you for spending this time on a question that does not have a clean answer yet. That, ultimately, is why it is worth asking. If you have not subscribed to Epoch Reset, consider doing so now. We cover exactly this category of historical question, the ones that the standard record leaves open, the ones where the evidence is real but the interpretation is still contested, the ones that require patience and precision rather than easy conclusions. If that is the kind of investigation that interests you, this is the right channel to be part of. We will be back.